Alright, let's talk about default control cards and default database cards. So, uh, we use Ansys LS-Dyna to prep a Dyna model, right? So Ansys LS-Dyna is this thing where you can essentially drag a LS-Dyna, system out here, and then you can load in geometry and do your model, which is essentially what we have here. So if you look at a basic model like this where there really isn't anything, right? But what usually happens is that if I were to mesh this part and write out the input file, right, I'm about to do, I'm gonna call this actually, hold on, let me go back. And then let's call this the trial or the demo. Right, I'm gonna call this file the demo file, demo k file. Now with a basic, with the standard, when you write out a control card, when you write out a model input file, such as this, right? What happens usually is that there is a set of control cards. You see these control cards right here, right? Are automatically created from the preprocessor that's called a workbench LS-Dyna. These are the control cards. There's also a bunch of database cards that's written up by the preprocessor. These things you can technically control them through the analysis setting, right? So for example, right here, the time history output are your database cards. The hourglass control, the damping control, and then there's some of the advanced setting right here, right? You see this thing called a default solver control cards. These are where these control cards and database cards are coming from, right? Now, for example, if I were to omit the control cards and if I were to omit the database cards and write out the input file again, what you will find is that a huge chunk of the input file has been removed, right? So basically, I no longer have any database card except for the D3 prop, and I no longer have any control cards. You see that all of the control cards except for the control termination, which is just defining your termination time, has been completely removed from the solver, right? From the preprocessor and from the input file. Now, what we really want to do, right, is to look at these default control cards. So let me write it out again. These default control cards, right, are really in a lot of ways incomplete, right? Because they're not everything that we want it to have, right? So if you look at the default control cards, which I actually created a slide deck to sort of show, right? So these are the different, the first line item right here, first image is the default control cards. The second one is what I personally would use on my own. I'll explain that. But basically, if you look at the default control card, for example, control energy, right, it's actually missing some of the parameter values. And if you look at something like the database binary, extend binary, right, the default database extend binary, let me write that out, is actually really bare, and it's actually sometimes not what we wanted. So for example, if I were to write this out again, and look at my input file, right, you can see like the control contact, for example, is also has parameter, which is not what we want. But if you look at the database extend binary, right, you see this parameter right here, is defaulting to only outputting stress. Now I can change that to string, but change this value to 11, right? And then there are things in here that's currently are 0, which we actually want to change the value of, because there are problems that's not trivial, that's going to require manipulation of these database files. And this is even more true for control cards, right? So for example, you see the control ignore 2 right here, which is default coming off the control contact, right? But if we want to resolve any initial penetration, we actually want to change this number to 0 instead of 2. So there's a lot of different changes that we often have to make to the control cards and the database cards that we are not going to have a very easy time changing them in the GUI, because the GUI, you can sort of see there's a lot of different buttons you have to press to change a few numbers in a text file. So which is easier, clicking button in the GUI or change a few numbers in the text file, right? So my opinion is that the best way to handle this is to actually create a default text file that's the master database file, and a master text file that's the master control card files, which is used for every single problem. And for problem where you need to make some small modifications, right, for experienced Dyna users, which is what we all want to get to, right, we can just modify the we can just modify the numbers individually based on a case-by-case basis, which is what I recommend that we do, right? So for example, right, like I mentioned, I have prepared a slide deck mostly for myself to remind myself the key parameter that might be open to change. So for example, if I want to adjust the amount of penetration that's allowed, I can adjust this parameter. If I want to resolve initial penetration, I can change the ignore parameter, right? And this apply to every single control cards, such as bulk viscosity, such as solid, which defines the behavior of solid elements, right? There's a lot of different things, such as at what way is the solid element going to be deleted due to negative volume. These are all things in which we can control within the individual control cards. So basically what we can actually do, right, in a model like this, and I'm going to show that at the end as the demonstrations, right, which is that we can actually set this to omit. We can also set this to never, right? Which means we're no longer going to use any control cards and we're no longer going to use any database cards. Instead, what we do is to create a command object called database. And then guess what? I'm going to copy paste my entire database card to this, right? I can change the DT if I wanted to, right? I can change whatever number I wanted to. And these parameters are what I've created that's going to be best for the default common problems, right? For any special edge case problem, I can just change the value. Similarly, I can also create another command snippet called a control cards, right? And these control cards are going to be based on my default control cards, which I've created for what I determine to be the best possible case for my problem. And then I usually would like to comment out the hourglass card, because I like to make sure my hourglass card is created individually for each component as opposed to have a global level hourglass card. Alright, so once I have my database card inserted and I have my control card inserted, I can just write out my whole code model, right? If I write out my whole model, what you will find is that you can see the database card that I created for myself, and then the control card that I created is going to replace the default cards, which are no longer written. And this really allows us to be able to control what database and control card we're using, which are critical for a lot of different kind of model, right? Even only the simplest model can really deal with the control cards that are written by default, especially, right? For anything that's a little bit edge case, a little bit special, a little bit different, we really need to look at the individual control cards to make sure we're generating the correct behavior, which is why it's critical to write your own control cards and database cards.